This story contains graphic content, intense violence, and disturbing imagery. It is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The air had shifted. Something dark, something unnatural, had been closing in on me for days. It wasn't fear. I have long since forgotten the sensation of fear, but a lingering scent on the wind, a feeling of being watched from the shadows. I've lived through the rise and fall of empires. I've bathed in the blood of kings and warriors alike. Yet here, now, I could feel them stalking me, picking at the edges of my dominion. They were no ordinary men. I knelt over the bloodless corpse of a lesser vampire, its eyes glazed over, its throat slit clean. The Forsworn had left him here for me to find, a calling card of sorts. These hunters weren't subtle. They wanted me to know they were close, a childish attempt to intimidate me. But they had done something no mortal had managed in centuries. They had inconvenienced me. I crushed the corpse's skull beneath my boot and straightened, letting the crimson-streaked moonlight wash over me. The scent of blood was thick on the wind, carried from somewhere deep in the forest. I could hear their heartbeats, slow and steady, hundreds of feet away. They were patient, calculating. They believed they had the advantage. They were wrong. I took a deep breath, tasting the air, the scent of silver. They had been preparing for this. I could feel the faint sting of it already, woven into the weapons they carried, lining the traps they'd set. It was clever, a well-planned ambush. But it wasn't the ambush that impressed me. It was their confidence. They thought they could kill me, and for that, I would make them suffer. I let them come to me. The first to reveal themselves was fast. A hunter, cloaked in dark leathers, darted out of the trees with a silver-tipped blade aimed for my throat. I sidestepped his strike with ease, my fingers closing around his wrist with a bone-crushing grip. He didn't even have time to scream before I twisted, snapping the arm clean from his body with a wet, sickening crack. Blood sprayed across my face as the hunter's body crumpled at my feet. His scream finally tore free, high-pitched and panicked as he clawed at the stump where his arm had been. I smiled, watching him writhe in the dirt for a moment, then drove my boot through his skull. His head burst like an overripe fruit, sending shards of bone and brain matter splattering across the ground. The trees around me rustled, and I sensed the others moving in. They had thought they could take me by surprise, that their numbers would be enough to overwhelm me. Pathetic. Another hunter lunged at me from behind, wielding a spear tipped with silver. I turned just in time to catch the weapon in my hand. The silver burned my palm, the skin hissing and blackening at the contact, but I held fast. The hunter's eyes widened in shock as I yanked him forward, slamming the butt of the spear into his face. His nose shattered in a spray of blood and cartilage, his body crumpling beneath me as I drove the spear through his chest. The silver tip pierced his heart, the light in his eyes fading as he spasmed and died. Their blood soaked into the earth, and I felt it call to me. They kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. 5 of them rushed me at once, 2 wielding swords, another with a chain wrapped in silver, another with a crossbow loaded with holy bolts. I could feel the burn of their weapons before they even touched me, the faint shimmer of the traps they had laid out. But I was not so easily caught. I blurred forward, my speed leaving the hunters scrambling to keep up. The first sword caught my side, slicing a thin line of fire across my ribs. The second blade swung high, aiming for my neck. I ducked low, my fingers finding the hunter's throat, and ripping it out in a single motion. He gurgled, collapsing in a heap, clutching his ruined neck as his blood sprayed in thick arcs. I spun to face the others, letting the blood rain down on me like a baptism. The crossbow fired, the bolt striking my chest with a dull thud. Pain bloomed from the wound, a sharp, fiery burn that spread across my ribcage. I glanced down at the bolt lodged in my flesh, the silver tip buried deep in muscle and bone. Clever, painful, but not enough. I tore the bolt free with a snarl, the flesh around the wound already starting to knit itself back together. The hunter who fired the shot hesitated, his confidence wavering as he realized what he was up against. I could smell the fear on him now, sharp and acrid. He was young, inexperienced, easy prey. I moved faster than his eyes could track, my hand plunging through his chest, my fingers wrapping around his still beating heart. He let out a choked gasp, staring at me in disbelief as I pulled the heart free from his chest, watching the life drain from his eyes as his body crumpled to the ground. I crushed the heart in my fist, letting the blood drip down my arm. But even as I dispatched the hunters one by one, I could feel it. A slow, creeping weakness. Their weapons, their traps, were not meant to kill me outright. They were designed to wear me down, to sap my strength little by little. The silver burned hotter now, the wounds slower to heal. Each strike left a lingering ache, each blow digging deeper into me than the last. They weren't trying to win with strength. They were trying to outlast me. I killed the next two with brutal efficiency, one by ripping his jaw clean from his face, leaving his tongue wagging obscenely as his blood poured out. The other, I snapped his spine in my grip and tossed him aside like a broken doll. His body twisted in unnatural angles as it hit the ground. His screams cut short as death claimed him. But the pain remained, festering just beneath my skin. I could feel the silver coursing through my veins, poisoning me from the inside. It slowed my movements, clouded my mind. For the first time in centuries, I was being hunted. The Forsworn had planned well. I heard the click of a trap too late. My foot hit the pressure plate, and I felt the sharp snap of silver-laced wires springing up around me, tightening around my limbs, searing into my flesh. I roared in fury, yanking at the wires, but they held fast, burning deeper into my skin with every movement. From the shadows, the leader of the Forsworn stepped forward. He was older, his face scarred and weathered from years of battle. In his hands, he held a great sword, its blade glowing with an unnatural light. Runes were carved into the steel, pulsating with dark energy. "You've slaughtered my men, vampire," he said, his voice cold and unfeeling. "But now, it ends." I bared my fangs, my vision swimming as the silver sapped my strength. My blood dripped onto the ground, sizzling as it met the cursed metal. The pain was excruciating, but I refused to show weakness. He raised the sword high above his head, preparing for the final strike. The silver wires dug deeper, and I could feel my strength waning, but I was not ready to die. Not today. Not ever. As the blade came down, I let the shadows engulf me. I became one with the night, slipping free from the wires in a blur of darkness. The leader's sword struck the ground where I had been standing, and in the same instant, I was behind him. I drove my hand through his chest, tearing his spine free in one savage motion. His eyes widened in shock as he looked down at the gaping hole in his torso. Blood gushed from the wound, pouring over my arm, soaking the ground beneath us. "I am eternal," I whispered, my voice low and filled with fury. "You, however, are not." I watched as the light faded from his eyes, his body crumpling in my grasp. I dropped him to the ground like a broken toy, turning to face the rest of the Forsworn. They had come to kill me, and they had failed. But they would not get the mercy of a quick death. No. They would suffer for their arrogance, and I would make sure their end was slow and agonizing. The smell of blood saturated the air, thick and sweet. It clung to my skin, soaking into the cracks of my armor. The bodies of the Forsworn littered the ground around me, twisted and broken, their limbs scattered like fallen leaves. Yet the night was not done with them. No, their torment had only just begun. I could feel their panic, the desperate realization that I was not something they could slay. They had come to hunt me, yet here they were, cowering in the shadows like the animals they were. I could smell their fear, sharp and acrid, cutting through the copper tang of blood, and I savored it. I walked slowly through the carnage, the soft squelch of flesh and bone beneath my boots the only sound. One of the Forsworn, a younger man, had managed to drag himself away, his legs shattered, leaving a trail of viscera behind him. He was trying to crawl to the edge of the forest, his fingers digging into the dirt, leaving furrows in the earth as he whimpered and gasped. I let him crawl, watching with a faint smile as he struggled. His blood pooled around him, thick and dark, soaking into the ground. Every inch he moved seemed to take an eternity, his body broken and useless. I could hear his breath rattling in his chest, each inhale more labored than the last. When he had gone as far as he could, I stepped in front of him, my shadow falling over his ruined form. He looked up, his face twisted in pain, his eyes wide with terror. "Please," he rasped, blood bubbling from his lips. "Please, just kill me." I crouched down, my fingers brushing his cheek, smearing the blood across his pale skin. "Kill you?" I whispered, leaning closer so he could see the hunger in my eyes. "Oh no, little hunter. That would be too merciful." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling the weak, frantic flutter of his heart beneath my palm. With slow, deliberate force, I pushed my fingers into his ribcage, my nails cutting through flesh and bone like wet parchment. He screamed, his back arching off the ground as I pried his chest open. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and shrill, cutting through the stillness of the night. I grinned as I felt his heart beating frantically against my fingers, his blood gushing over my hand. With a final brutal twist, I ripped it from his chest, holding the still pulsing organ in front of his face. His eyes, wide and filled with horror, fixed on it as the last vestiges of life drained from him. I watched him die slowly, savoring every second of his agony. When his body finally stilled, I crushed the heart in my hand, letting the blood drip down my arm like warm rain. The others were watching. I could feel their eyes on me, hear the ragged breath of the remaining Forsworn as they cowered in the trees, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. They had tried to fight me with silver, with magic, with desperation, and they had failed. I stood and turned, my gaze locking onto another of the hunters, a woman, her body pinned beneath a fallen tree, her leg twisted at a grotesque angle. Her sword lay just out of reach, her trembling hand extended toward it, as if it might save her. I tilted my head, watching her for a moment, then strode toward her in a slow, deliberate pace. She saw me coming, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving in a silent prayer. I grabbed the tree with one hand and lifted it from her body, throwing it aside like it weighed nothing. She tried to scramble away, her broken leg dragging uselessly behind her, but I grabbed her by the ankle, dragging her back toward me. Her screams filled the night, but no one could save her. I flipped her onto her back, crouching over her as her hands feebly pushed against my chest. Her broken leg twitched uselessly, the bone protruding through the skin in a sickening display of shattered flesh. I wrapped my fingers around her throat, squeezing just enough to cut off her air. Her face turned a deep shade of red, her mouth opening and closing in a desperate bid for breath. "Do you feel it?" I asked, my voice a low growl. "That cold hand of death closing in around you?" She tried to speak, but all that escaped her lips was a strangled, gurgling sound. I leaned closer, my lips brushing against her ear. "It's a mercy I don't give freely." With a savage twist, I wrenched her leg at the broken point, the sound of bone grinding against bone making my own blood sing with delight. She howled in pain, her body convulsing beneath me. I tightened my grip on her throat until I felt the life drain from her, her body falling limp beneath my hand. I rose, my eyes sweeping over the remaining hunters. They were few now, scattered and broken, the fight drained from them. But they would not get the luxury of despair. They would die here, in the dirt, choking on their own blood. One of them, the last who still had a weapon in hand, charged at me with a war cry. His sword was silver, the blade glinting in the moonlight as he swung it toward my neck. I caught the blade in my hand, the silver burning my flesh, but I held it firm. His eyes widened in shock as I gripped the blade, the skin of my hand sizzling and cracking under the silver's bite. I didn't flinch. Instead, I wrenched the sword from his grasp and drove it through his stomach, twisting it until the tip burst out his back. He gasped, clutching at the blade, his mouth opening and closing as blood poured from the wound, pooling at his feet. "How does it feel?" I asked, watching him as he sank to his knees, still gripping the sword lodged in his gut. "To know that you came here to kill me, and now you die for nothing." His lips moved, a feeble attempt at words, but I had no interest in his final thoughts. I grabbed his head and twisted sharply, snapping his neck with a sickening crack. His body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. I turned to the last of them. He stood at the edge of the battlefield, his hand wrapped around the hilt of a silver-tipped spear. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the realization of his impending doom. He didn't run. He knew it was over, but still, he held his ground, his grip tightening on the spear as I approached. "I've killed monsters before," he said, his voice shaking but defiant. "You're nothing special." I smiled, my fangs glinting in the moonlight. Oh, little hunter, you haven't even begun to see what I am. I lunged at him, my hand closing around his throat as I lifted him off the ground. He struggled, slamming the spear into my side, the silver burning as it pierced my flesh. I growled, feeling the pain radiate through my body, but it only fueled my rage. I tightened my grip on his throat until I felt the bones begin to crack beneath my fingers. His face turned red, then purple, his eyes bulging as he fought for breath. "You thought you could kill me?" I hissed, squeezing harder. "You thought your silver, your magic, your petty little weapons could stop me?" I yanked the spear from my side with a snarl, feeling the searing burn of the silver as it left my flesh. My fingers clenched around the blood-slicked shaft, and with a savage thrust, I drove it through his chest, pinning him to the ground like an insect beneath a nail. He gasped, a wet, gurgling sound as blood bubbled from his lips, his body convulsing in agonized spasms. But that was not enough. I crouched beside him, watching his eyes widen in terror as his lungs struggled to draw breath. His hands scrabbled weakly at the spear, but it was hopeless. I could feel the feeble flutter of his heart, the frantic beat, slowing, fighting against the inevitable. It would have been so easy to let him slip into death's embrace. But easy was not what I wanted. I wanted him to suffer. Without a word, I ripped the spear from his chest, his blood spurting from the gaping wound in thick, pulsing streams. He tried to scream, but I grabbed his lower jaw and twisted. The bones snapped, the skin tearing with a sickening crack, leaving his mouth hanging open in a grotesque, unnatural angle. His eyes bulged, filled with the sheer terror of what was coming next. With brutal efficiency, I drove my hand into his torso, the ribs cracking like brittle twigs as my fingers curled around his spine. His body jerked violently as I tightened my grip and pulled, tearing the vertebrae from his body in a spray of blood, flesh, and shattered bone. His torso split open, entrails spilling out onto the dirt, the pungent stench of death filling the air. He convulsed, his body twitching violently. But his agony was far from over. I held his broken spine in one hand, raising it so he could see the jagged ruin of his body. His eyes fluttered, the last spark of life fading from them. And still, I smiled. With a final savage pull, I ripped his body apart, his limbs tearing free from the torso with a sickening wet pop. Blood and viscera sprayed the earth, pooling around my feet as I stood over the mangled remains of what had once been a man. His heart gave one last pitiful flutter before it stilled, the final breath rattling from his ruined chest. "Look around you," I whispered, gesturing to the carnage surrounding us. "This is what your arrogance has earned you. Death, suffering, and soon your name will be forgotten, just like the others." When it was done, I stood and surveyed the battlefield. Bodies lay scattered, broken and torn apart, their blood soaking the earth. The night was silent now, the only sound the soft crackling of the flames in the distance. The Forsworn were no more. I had let none escape. They had thought they could hunt me, but now they were nothing more than meat for the crows. As I walked away from the carnage, I felt the weight of centuries settle back onto my shoulders. They had been skilled, yes, but in the end, they were just another group of fools who thought they could stop the night. And the night, as always, is mine.